we are back, and I want to talk about my use of notebooks. This is my current notebook and has been for almost a year. I started using it in November of 2024, and now it's September 2025. I've been using notebooks as a form of journal and planner for a long time, maybe 15 years. And I have, changed how I use them over those years, but I want to go over how I use it right now, because I feel like I'm in a good rhythm with it, which is not always the case, and talk about why I think they're important. But some of these other people that talk about notebooks will talk about these systems they have in place. And I think those can not always be the most helpful. It can be helpful to have a system. The bullet journal system can be helpful. And there are bits that I've used from that more religiously at times than others. But again, I feel like I'm in a good spot with where this is right now. Which uses some of those, but doesn't necessarily demand that much of you. And first we should talk about why you should use a notebook at all, compared to the Notes app on your phone, scrap paper, any sort of digital use case where you can write down things, be it handwriting with an Apple Pencil, be it, again, Notes app, task managers, calendars, things like that. And first I want to be clear that I do use some digital tools as well, especially when it comes to collaborative things. My wife and I have a calendar that we share on iCloud, for example. We share a lot of events with each other that way. And I still use that. And there's overlap. There's overlap with this. But first, again, why? Why a notebook? And I want to highlight something that perhaps people miss. This is not just a piece of stationery, but it's a tool for thought, for living, essentially, for ensuring that you are living the way that you would like to, and resisting that pull of digital distraction. And if you've, watched my previous videos on Zettelkasten, you'll understand kind of where I'm coming from there in terms of using tools that enable us to avoid the sort of digital sludgery that we can often get once we start putting our tools for thinking onto these devices that we also use for entertainment and for mindless time wasting, ultimately. So you should use a notebook, I think, to ensure that you're living attentively, that you are in your space. If we think about it more philosophically, it's a way to slow down, notice things perhaps that you don't otherwise notice, and to dwell in the place that you are, both physically and spiritually, soulfully. We'll get into a little bit of what the notebook does to enable that. But first I'll tell you why I am using this particular notebook and what this is. So for many years I used initially Moleskine, but then I got into the Leuchtturm 1917 notebooks, used those for years and years. But I'd always wanted the Traveler's notebook, which is something like this, but bigger. It's about the height of this notebook, but a little bit slimmer. And I used that for a few years, more recently. But the frustrating thing I had with that is the notebooks are quite slim, so maybe 120 pages in them. And I would go through several of those a year. And the way that I like to use this notebook is as much a reference of things that I've put in there as anything. While you can put multiple of these slim notebooks into a traveler's notebook, it simply wasn't really working for me the way I wanted it to. And there was a company out of France making these beautiful, beautiful notebooks that I could put in there with about 300 pages, but they are still going, but they're not making notebooks anymore. So at the end of last year, I was just looking for what is the thickest notebook I can find. And this is actually from Midori, which is the company behind Traveler's Company that make the Traveler's Notebook. And this is their Codex journal. So it's got about 365 pages, one for each day of the year. But it's completely blank inside. Let's find a blank page here, of which I'm running out of. Completely blank. It just has these little dashes in the bottom, and then I've put my page numbers in there. And so I wanted a notebook that was going to last me for the whole of 2025, essentially. And you'll see why that's important to me as we get into it. The downside, of course, is that this is not super portable. Obviously you can carry it around, but it doesn't fit in your pocket. And I'm not taking it with me absolutely everywhere. What I kind of did to fix that problem is I made this, which is essentially what the traveler's notebook passport size. So you can buy one like this, but it was about $55 just for the leather, and then you have to buy the notebooks. And I've got this sort of insert for my wallet. And I just found this piece of leather at Michael's, like an 8.5 by 11 sheet of leather. And I thought maybe I can just use that. And you can buy a repair kit for the traveler's notebooks. So I just bought that, which gave me everything else I need, cut this to size, cut a few holes in it, and put the elastics in. And that's been serving me well for 18 months or so. I made it last summer. So now I have at least something where I can write down things. While I'm on the go, I usually have a pen loop here, or a pencil or a pen in my pocket as well. So that takes care of the portability aspect, especially when I'm using something a bit heftier like this. So what goes in here? Well, it's kind of a ironic beginning to how I use this bigger, heftier notebook. The inspiration actually came from a video game, which I don't play very often. I don't do a lot of video games, but occasionally if there's something that looks interesting, I'll give it a go. Just on the cloud gaming, if I can stream it onto my phone or something, I'll try it out. And this particular game was the Indiana Jones game that came out last year or a couple of years ago. I played it for a couple of weeks, and the interesting thing about that game is the sort of map that you use as you play the character. You're going around exploring these different areas. The map that you use and where you get all of your information that you can reference to figure out what you are supposed to do is Indiana Jones's journal. So you kind of click the button, the journal comes up, you can look at the map, change pages and all of this, and it looks like physical paper. And I just really liked that. I liked the idea of having this big book that you just keep everything in. And so that's essentially what this has become. When I have stuff I want to keep, I just throw it in here. And so it's kind of a scrapbook. It's a place to store memories, but also it's also a place that I create with. Something I again started doing with this one, given that the cover is essentially cardstock, it's just white paper, is I stamp different things on here. When I go to national parks, state parks, they have those stamp stations. I like to do that on the cover, adds a bit of customization, a bit of patina. And so when it comes to using this, for a while, I was using it as sort of a bullet journal, you could say. Each day I would have, the date, write down my necessary events, calendar events, things like that, and then the tasks I had to work on. And then throughout the day, let's say I get a phone call, I'll just put a dash, write phone call with so-and-so, and as I'm on the phone, I'm just taking notes, and then I can go back and reference it. And when that's for my job as an attorney, what I then would have is a page where I just list all of the cases that I'm working on. And then whenever I have a phone call about a particular case or a court hearing where I write down what's happening, and then go to that reference page of my list of cases, write the page number that contains the day where I'm making those notes, and on and on and on. So let's say on page 60, I'm using page 60 on Monday, September 1st. Then I write about the case, John Doe versus John Doe. I would then go to my reference page, and let's say that's on page 200, and find John Doe versus John Doe, write page 60. And then let's say on Wednesday, September 3rd, I have another phone call on that same case, and that's on page 63 by that point. I've used a few pages over the days. I'll go back to page 200 with the reference, go down to John Doe versus John Doe, and then write page 63. So then a year from now, if I need to look at what I was doing on this case, I just go to that reference page and see, okay, on page 60 I made notes, on page 63 I made notes, and I can go back and see what those notes were. So it acts as a sort of index, and that's very helpful. I see it akin as to the bi-directional linking you might do in something like Obsidian or Notion, but just in a notebook. And that's one of the reasons I wanted such a thick notebook, so that I can reference these things for a long time in the same notebook. I can do it across notebooks, but it just becomes more difficult to go back and reference it unless I'm at home and I have my archive of notebooks available to me. I wanted to be able to travel with more history, if that makes sense. One of my favorite ways that I've been using this notebook this year has been a place to process my raw experiences into thought. So I do a lot of writing, a lot of essays for The Void, and typically typing is the first place I go to do that on my free write. Again, there's a video about that you can check out. But more and more this year, I've been doing my first drafts in my notebook. And I've always loved handwriting. I've always found it an effective way to begin writing. And it's become quite an important part of my writing process this year. I'll still use the free write to do the initial typing up, and that's where I can offer just some initial revisions before I go on to a second draft of that piece of writing later. But here I can just sort of get into that writing zone, which has been, again, a very effective, nice way to write without having to depend on any technology at all, just pen and paper. One example of this is my essay, Kierkegaard Must Be Read Playfully. Now, I began writing about this quite early this year, and started writing on it. I was reading a book on the new Kierkegaard, talking about Kierkegaard through the lens of Jacques Derrida, and I just had some ideas that I wanted to jot down. I just wrote just a page here, and then if you look in the bottom corner, it's an arrow that says 170. And so that's when I picked up writing on this again, page 170, which was not until April or May. So this first page is from January. And I began again writing on this in April. And that's what I like about having this longer notebook, is that I can go back and just let things simmer and come back to them and thread through them, through the notebook. This idea of threading does come from the bullet journal. And I use it, I think, in a richer way than the bullet journal describes, but it's essentially the same idea. So I can turn to any page and see, well, if this page is connected to any others, I can then follow that thread backwards and forwards. And so I wrote a couple pages here, 170, 171, and then you can just see again, there's an arrow on the bottom right, takes me to 246, where I pick up that thread again. And that goes on for many pages until I find the end. And so this is something I've been able to work on really all year, picking it up, putting it down. It's been able to gestate. So when I'm ready with some new ideas to write about the topic, I can pick it up and not be concerned that, oh, I used the next page, I can't continue it on, which is very freeing because it permits you to, write about something and not worry about where it has to go. You just find the next empty page and begin writing, picking up where you left off before. One way that I integrate my use of this notebook in with the Zettelkasten, if you've watched those videos, is here's where I will sort of use the space to outline an essay I'm getting from my Zettelkasten. So you can see this very first page in the notebook. Each of these numbers on the left-hand side correspond to a Zettelkasten card. And I sort of outline the essay this way, and then can go on later to draft it up. And here you see November 21st, Zettelkasten conversation, just a conversation that I had, which eventually turned into an essay I published in The Void. So what is actually in my notebook? Well, it's everything. I keep these little month markers down the side, and each month, just make the month, write in everything I've got going on, and then I've got daily pages where I'll write down tasks, things like that. And then it's mostly just notes, thoughts, essays, things that I'm working on. I teach a philosophy class at a local university. My lecture notes, they go in here. Then I just have this open on the podium in front of me as I teach. The attendance log for my class stays in here. This is an essay I was working on and a relevant sketch. All just next to each other, random drawings, things that I like to do for fun. Outlining ideas for a potential book. When I'm working on The Void, I'll generally make a list of all the things I expect to go in there from different contributors. And that's really it. Page to page, it can be all sorts of different things. I've got, notes from a meeting I attended for my church, and then a lot of doodles in the corner when the meeting was not relevant to me. And the main idea behind it is not to systematize my life in any way. I don't want my life to be a system. This is more a record of what's happened. I can go back and see what I was really thinking, what I was working on, the ideas that I had brewing. But it also acts as a sort of physical anchor for my day, for my life. It exists in the room all the time. It doesn't turn off, doesn't run out of battery, doesn't go away if the internet cuts out. And I think having a place like that meets those qualifications, to keep the rhythms, events, ideas, and thoughts of your daily life is important. If I didn't have this, when I think back on what's happened this year, what I've done, what I've thought about, I'd either have to go on my phone, scroll through the Photos app, wherever I might be doing digital writing, and see what just I happen to type in there. But there's no trace. There's no trace of when that occurred. I'm sure everything is, date stamped and location stamped, but this is all modifiable data. You can go into a photo and change the date and time it was captured, change the location. Obviously, no one really does this, but let's say you're traveling. If I were to go to England from here in California, my phone changes time zones automatically, but then all of my photos, those times change as well. So if I'm looking for a photo I took in the afternoon here, it may very well show up as being taken early the next morning when I'm in the UK. Those sorts of little, funny consequences of a digital life, they're just not a problem with something like this. This is what it is. It's not going to change. It's not going to get a bug unless one gets slapped on the cover. Of course you can lose it. All sorts of things can happen, but those are real things that can happen to the real thing, and that seems more important. And of course, if I lose this, someone finds it, sees it's of no real monetary value, gets my information in the front, and likely gives it back. The benefit of it being so chunky is that you're unlikely to leave it behind. There's this idea that if you want to live deliberately, with some sort of purpose, and this is the antithesis, of course, to spending your time wasting away on the doom scrolling, the brain rot. You have to pause, reflect, think. And the notebook's a place to do that. You open up to a blank page and it's your job to fill it. Put something down. Capture what's going through your mind. And if you think, well, I haven't got anything worth saying, how do you know? Have you tried it? I wager that you start putting something down and you'd be surprised what could come out. Maybe not at first, but if you establish a habit of just writing things down, eventually it becomes easier. Like learning a sport, tennis, let's say. First time you try that backhand, not going to go so well, but over time you'll get the feeling of it, and every so often you'll just hit that ball just right. The ball will go over the net, land in the corner of the court, and you'll feel like nothing even happened, and yet it did, and it was perfect. And occasionally you get glimpses of that writing in your notebook. When that happens, it's special, but you have to put in the work to get there. And really, to do that work, you just have to have a notebook and set time aside to use it. I think something that puts a lot of people off is the inability to organize the information that goes in your notebook. Now, that threading feature that I've covered, I think, is one of the main ways I stay organized, and I combine that with an index at the back. I talked about the case index that I have for my legal work, but I also just keep an index for the entire notebook. It goes in the back, and every so often I'll update it. So here you can see Kierkegaard must be read playfully, and I can see all the pages where I've written on that topic. Or I can go to a chapel message I gave at my university, my camping plans for a trip in February, I've got book notes in here, notes from classes when I've had to write down something important, timelines from cases, maintenance for my car. Everything goes in here. And that's kind of the point. It can go from here into all sorts of different places. I've discussed the void or an online Substack article perhaps. Or maybe it just stays in here as a memento of what I was thinking at the time. Something I use a lot is this card. This is from Traveler's Company. And given that this has blank pages, I'll put this behind the page I'm writing on and then clip it in. And then I've got lines I can work with. And what I do like about this is, as I put it behind, it only covers about 2/3 of the page, as you can see, like that. So then when I use this, I have a sort of margin. And I like this because I do tend to baby sound, ultrasound of my baby. This gives me a margin for when I come back and I can add things on later. And I think that's important too, because I don't necessarily just work in chronological order. I'll go back to pages past and review them, annotate them, think about them. Again, if we look at my pages on Kierkegaard, Must Be Read Playfully, you can see that first I wrote in pen, quite a bit down. Then I came back later, I've got this pencil, started writing ideas, drawing connections, making little annotations, B.1, just a little system to try and order things together. And not only did this help my essay writing, but then I can take these sort of atomic thoughts, these units, and turn them into Zettelkasten note cards. Of course, one of the joys of using a notebook is the way that it ages with you. In one of my early YouTube videos, you can actually see this notebook sitting on my desk, and it's completely unrecognizable. It's a nice, clean, white box with perfect sides. Lovely. Now look at it. You know, it's got dirt and grime on the front, essentially, and these stamps, coffee stains, the sticker on the back, which is fading away, all these things down the side, dirty corners. You go to certain pages, and there's smudges and coffee stains and, you know, all sorts of things. And, you know, you get carried away with that to some degree, but it's nice to see how something ages along with you. It starts to bear the scars of the year. You know, the more travel you do, the more it probably gets beaten up. You know, this goes in my saddlebag on my motorcycle, and, you know, shifting around with all sorts of other things in there. And that in itself is a form of record of the year. I think in a separate video, I'll go through the sort of tools I use, such as this pen, fountain pens, pencils, things like that. And I have a way to carry those around with me as well. But those, in a way, are just as important, because you can't use a notebook without something to write with. But of course, you just need something with you. And what that is doesn't really matter, but you can ascribe some meaning to that too. This notebook really functions as a mirror. If you ever have the feeling of time going too fast, you almost forget who you were, maybe even 3-6 months ago. I look back at some of the entries I have here just from May or June, which was, 2, 3, 4 months ago. I'm astounded by how long ago those feel. And when I look at what I was writing at that time, if I didn't have that in the notebook, I honestly couldn't remember that I was writing those things, that I was thinking about those things. But I can now go back and almost have a conversation with who I was then, and what I was thinking then. And with that time, with those several months that have passed, I've been able to change and let things gestate in a way that actually provides very fruitful conversation going back to those earlier pages. And so I try and make a habit of doing that, especially if it seems to be a common experience. You sit down to write and you don't know what to write. Obviously, I advocate for the Zettelkasten, but you could have one of these without a Zettelkasten and still get that sort of conversational experience just from reviewing the notes you've taken, the thoughts you've jotted down, and the sort of essay drafts that you have in there. Something that I think is very important to touch on is this idea of perfection. Especially on the internet, you have lots of people sharing these notebook pages full of beautiful designs, beautiful handwriting, and that's all lovely. It's a wonderful way to put your creativity down, but this is not artwork. It's not perfection by any means. Any page I turn to will have some sort of mistakes, things crossed out, written again. I've got ink splodges from when my pen started leaking. It's not about a perfect record. Mistakes are okay. They're part of life. And it's okay to have them in your notebook. It seems silly for me to even have to say personally, but I suppose some people do think that way, and it keeps them from trying. Of course, one of the great benefits of keeping a physical notebook, especially over time, is it's an archive of you. Evidence that you were here, that you thought things, that you did things. A time will come when I'm no longer here. And perhaps my children will see these notebooks as paperweights, something to be thrown away of no monetary value, but perhaps they'll see them as a way to still talk to me, a way to stay connected with me once I'm gone. A little phrase that I wrote down in 2018 when I was graduating from university is I'd rather leave behind an analog legacy than a digital one. And that's what this is. It's an analog legacy that will outlive me. And that's something. So I'm curious if you use a notebook, if you use it in this way, a planner, a diary, a sketchbook. And if you don't have one, what could you fill one with? It can be quite intimidating to have one this big, but also quite freeing